questions to begin tonight. One of which is opinionated, one of which is actually just First question. Okay. Which of the following is not included on your farm in the farm bill? So with your clickers that you just got, you just need 1, 2, 3, or 4 for A, B, C, and D. Pretty straightforward. I think you can handle it. Okay, we did a few. I was going to make an announcement to make sure that we say that this is not an official poll, not using scientific yeah. Actually, believe it or not, the one that was number 1 is actually included in there. Rural broadband internet is included in the farm bill, among a vast array of other things. Pretty significant bill, very, very large. Wildlife preservation is not included in the bill. Oh, there you go. Yeah. A little corn. All right. So what percentage of farm bill funding goes towards food stamps? Feel free to get up at any point in time, grab pizza, get a drink, whatever. Very informal event. So, Parker, we'll let you get started.
Okay, I'm talking quietly because I have a cold, so I hope everyone can hear me. So I'm going to try to give you 70 years of foreign policy in 5 minutes. So our modern farm policy originates in the post-World War II period with what we call the permanent legislation of the late 1940s. And what becomes quickly apparent after the 1950s is that the Farm Bill is not a farm bill. and it's increasingly become less and less a farm bill, which is appropriate given that we are no longer, the vast majority of the population is no longer employed in agriculture. When the farm bills were originally proposed in the 40s, they were called the Agriculture Act, when 50% or 40% of the population was working in agriculture. Today, a couple of million people work directly in the agriculture sector. And so you see that transformation from the Agricultural Act of 1948 to the Food and Agricultural Act of 1965 to the Food, Agriculture, Conservation, and Trade Act of 1990 to the Food, Conservation, and Energy Act of 2008, which has nothing about the farms in it. And there's a reason for that. Because, as you saw, the components, there are three basic components to farm policy, as we call it, or agricultural policy, or the USDA, is that there's production, farm security, and rural America. That's one area. It's relatively a small area of the policy. There's environment, particularly as it pertains to agriculture, in the form of the Conservation Reserve Program, the Wetland Reserves Program, and the Grassland Reserve Programs, all intended perhaps not to directly protect wildlife, but indirectly do a very good job doing it. And then third, and probably most importantly, in the modern Farm Bill, really dating back to the 60s, is the important role of nutrition, food policy, food education, and nutritional support. So three parts: production and farm security, the environment, and nutrition. And while the first one comes first, because that's historically a part of the bill, really as an important policy has not been seen as that important either by economists or from policymakers' perspectives. When we look at current expenditures of the Farm Bill, or farm expenditures, or agricultural expenditures, the Department of Agriculture, in fiscal year 13, the expenditures will be $156 billion. Until this week, I've got to double check now that we've had a compromise, the sequester would have led to total expenditures in FY14 of $146 billion, so a small decline, but still a significant amount of dollars. As we look at the budget, 73% are going towards food and nutrition programs, 14% is going towards the environment, and 10 or 15% is going towards farm programs. And so again, it's a food bill. I mean, that's the food bill, and the environment is a secondary issue, and then really agriculture is a tertiary issue. The real political debate, which I think we'll be talking about later, and it was addressed in that question, is this current movement to decouple the food part of the bill from the agriculture part of the bill, which reflects a 50-year compromise between rural states and urban states. The reason why you have the two components in the bill is because of the two parties, or not two parties, but different interest groups agreeing to support one another's policies. And that's the only way farmers were able to get the subsidies, and it was the way that low-income households and families were able to get food and nutrition support. And that's what we see in the current debate, is trying to go back on a 50-year compromise that has existed. I will conclude with a little piece which tells you a little connection between the McCarthy, Eugene McCarthy, and farm policy. And some of this is a bit apocryphal, but as you all know, or you may or may not know, when they had the break in the election in '68, when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Eugene McCarthy came to campus, and an interesting piece of the story is he sat down with renowned campus economist Father Martin Scherber, and they had a knockdown, drag-out fight over agricultural subsidies, because economists have generally opposed agricultural subsidies on the basis that it's an unnecessary distribution of wealth to otherwise relatively wealthy individuals, or increasingly that's been true. I think in '68 that wasn't as true. But of course, Eugene McCarthy was running for president. You can't believe that and run for president, that you don't need agricultural policies. So they had a long debate, and so we're continuing that debate today.
Katie, before you go, I just want to Thank you very much, Dr. Whitley, for that. I felt like I was watching Chris Berman try to run through like his fastest 3 minutes or whatever, and when he's giving all the highlights. But I really appreciate that. And then if you could just pass your clickers to the left, that'd be great. If you're at the table, let's all pass them to that corner. Then we're just going to overwhelm that corner. We'll pick them up again. So, thank you. Go ahead, Katie.
So I just want to say that the last Farm Bill was 628 pages, and I am by no means an expert on all of those 628 pages. But there are some niche areas within there that I'd like to address today, and kind of go off what Dr. Wheatley was saying too, in terms of the big question being this debate between farm and food. So first, I want to talk about kind of the problems that have arisen because of the lack of compromise on the latest Farm Bill. The 2008 Farm Bill expired September 2012, and if you guys have been following, there has been no solid negotiations met on renewing that Farm Bill. And a primary part of that is this conflict between farm and food. There's about these are rough estimates, but roughly in the House, it's recommended that about $40 billion would be cut from the SNAP program, whereas in the Senate it would be about $4 billion, where both of the bills are around the same amount of money. So it's not that one bill is significantly less expensive than the other, but just where those cuts are being made, and that's a huge point of contention there. And then also because the bill has dragged out for so long, there will be some economic consequences because of it. I know that Benny Lucas will talk about some of those in terms of the environment, but also in terms of farmers not receiving crop insurance payments for the large amounts of cattle that were lost in the early process last year. The Obama administration actually just released a report on the economic importance of passing the Farm Bill, if anyone wants to look that up after the budget's planned. But in general, both bills, and this might be talked about later with subsidies, but in general, both bills want to eliminate direct payments, which are paid to farmers whether they are farming or not, which would result in about $5 billion a year in savings. And then there's also debate on where these savings would go to and where the priorities are within this bill. So that's the history of the gridlock that's occurring right now in the context of the Farm Bill. Now to go in a little more deeply into food stamps, which is more formally known as the Supplemental Nutrition and Assistance Program, or SNAP. Almost 80%, about 73%, according to the fiscal year 2012 budget, goes to food and nutrition. And this has doubled since 2008 because of the economic crises. In addition to fluctuating food prices and the requirements were loosened in 2009 as in accordance with the economic stimulus bill as to who could receive SNAP. So the big question that I like to talk about when we get to more of our informal dialogue is whether or not these two elements should still be a part of it. Since such a huge majority of the Farm Bill is dedicated to food and nutrition, is it time to separate those? But then, going off of what Dr. Wheatley said, is there's been this huge history of compromise between rural and urban voters, and agreement on this big omnibus piece of legislation. So that's a question that I pose to you guys for later to ask us about or talk amongst yourselves about. And then also, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a thesis topic, which I've been working on for the last 4 months, which is comparing farm bills in the United States, Netherlands, and Australia. And globally, the United States is far behind on the precautions we're taking in terms of climate change. Farmers have been adapting to changes in climate for forever, but they are occurring at a magnitude and speed that has never before been seen, and there needs to be special attention paid to this in terms terms of how we grow our food, where we grow our food, and how we manage it when it's no longer growing in the ways that we're accustomed to. So in the entire 628-page food farm bill that currently is in place in 2001, there are only 2 references to climate change in the entire bill. And that is allocating a research fund specifically for climate change, but that is a lot of pages and a little reference, as opposed to, say, the European Union agricultural bill, which places a huge priority on climate change, and Australia as well. So those are my 3 areas that I wanted to touch on, and I'll pass over to Lucas and Denny to talk more about the environmental implications.
Hi, so the environmental and conservation issues that are sort of embedded in the Farm Bill are kind of squished between these 2 sides, one being the nutrition and the other being the food, the agricultural pieces. And conservation is inextricably linked because of the great impact that the agricultural impact or agricultural industry has on the environment. Large industrial farms, the agribusiness, which has developed in the last 100 years, has great environmental impacts. They account for about 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. They have impacts on our soil. They are using about 80% of all water in the United States, or account for 80% of the consumption in the United States. So that is a whole nother sort of talk about the sustainability of our agricultural industry. But within the Farm Bill, there are a number of elements that address conservation issues. In the bill, they have set, or in the past, they've allocated money for different programs like the Conservation Reserve Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which give financial incentives for farmers to practice sustainable farming techniques, things like conserving water or eliminating pollution or having an organic farm. And I think Denny can talk more on why conservation is so important in the United States and how elements of this bill will affect.
Hello? I've never used one of these before. So the conservation part of the Farm Bill actually is such a small percentage of the portion of money that actually goes to the agricultural industry and the farmers. But in 2008, when the Farm Bill was passed, it allocated about $24 billion to the actual conservation of wetlands and grasslands that farmers use. And part of that sustainability thing that Lucas had mentioned is just that, for example, some people receive money for not actually using farmland for farming that way. It doesn't cause like soil erosion later on in the future. But because of Congress's inability to pass a new farm bill last year in 2012 in September, all throughout 2013, we had the agricultural science had no money that was actually allocated towards conservation programs, which meant that throughout the whole year, there's really no reason for farmers to go to the efforts of conservation come out of their own personal means. They're not actually getting any reimbursement for the efforts. And then also, the House and the Senate have both been trying to pass new farm bills, like the Senate's Agricultural Reform Food and Jobs Act, which, if either the House or the Senate would pass either version, it would deduct the allocation of money by $3.5 to $5 billion. And on top of that, it would also remove the regulations that would keep the farmers actually going through the efforts of conservation. So that means that they would be receiving the money for conservation, but they wouldn't actually have to do anything with that. Then I guess something else just to mention is that the Farm Bill is also meant to protect these wetlands and grasslands, not only for the farming, but for the, I guess, preservation of the land. For example, in the United States, the wetlands and grasslands we have for the farmlands, which are privately owned, actually make up the nesting grounds of about half of North American species of birds. And so as the wetlands and grasslands are destroyed or used by farming, then those species of birds have less area to actually have the nesting grounds and small habitat, and then that can eventually lead to the extinction, of course. And then there's also the water pollution that occurs from the farming that's going on. And water pollution from farming is actually not addressed in the Clean Water Act. And so it's the Farm Bill's responsibility to address those issues.
All right, well, since you met these gentlemen talked about conservation, that's maybe the first thing I want to hit. I was asked to be here because I've had direct experience with the Farm Bill. My family farmed. My parents own about 600 acres in southern Minnesota, as well as raised about 10,000 hogs. And between my grandparents and my parents, we also have about 200 acres in the Conservation Reserve Program, as you guys mentioned. And what that is where basically the federal government, in an interest to preserve wetlands, grasslands, natural habitat in your area, basically rents their land from you and says, you own the land, you own the title of the land, but we own the rights to keep this land in its natural state, restore it back to its natural state. For some programs, CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, is generally a 10-year contract, and the CRP Wetlands Reserve Program is a lifetime thing, so forever. You lock into a contract forever, and whomever buys that, they're guaranteed a paycheck, but they can't ever till it up and put it back in the agricultural production. And we've done that for a myriad of reasons. We have a lot of, like you mentioned, around wetlands, we have the Minnesota state law allows up to 60 feet along drainage ditches, which acts as a natural filter, not only for things like pesticides and fertilizers that are applied, but also for dirt. A non-barrier ditch needs to be dredged out of the dirt that settles to the bottom every 10 years. When you have a 60 to 120 foot strip of grassland around it, that stretches that out to 75 years because the first few feet of that grass catches all that dirt. So that's one thing we can discuss a little later. I guess, and the biggest thing too that maybe didn't get mentioned before, some of the history, is the first Farm Bill. Basically, the government was working to buy up extra supply in the marketplace. So they bought up milk products, grain products, cheese, butter, all that stuff, and stored it. And that's how the home nutrition program started, is that the government had these stores of powdered milk and butter and cheese and all that stuff, and they turned around and they gave it to families whose incomes were low, things like that. My mom remembered back when she was a kid that coming to her local area, and some families participating in that. And then, like Parker said, in the late 70s, it turned into more of the food stamp program, where the government, instead of buying up the market, the government would pay the farmers either to produce or not to produce. And so that lasted until about the last decade, when instead of paying the farmers, a lot of times they would pay farmers not to run ground, not to plant corn or soybeans on the ground, because there was too much supply. Up until about 10 years ago, we grew 5 billion bushels of corn or so a year, and we used it all in a year. And there was a year's supply in the bin and in the elevators in the country before that. So there was an excess of supply, so the government would pay the farmers to not grow their products. And then about a decade ago, when ethanol started becoming big, all of a sudden the government realized, hey, instead of paying the farmers not to grow it, we can pay the farmers to put it in their gas tanks instead. And so that's really been the rise of ethanol. And whether for good or for bad, that's kind of been the evolution of the Farm Bill paying farmers. And one thing I want to mention too, the Farm Bill for farmers, for agriculturalists, the biggest things are food, fiber, fuel, and forestry. The Farm Bill regulates all of those industries, livestock, cash crop production, forestry, all of that. And like these guys have said, it's about 30% of that entire bill is those 4 key areas. And while the U.S.'s participation, labor participation in agriculture has declined, it's still between 15 and 20% of our total labor force. So that's still millions and millions of people whose livelihoods, whose paychecks, whose families depend on that money. And in the next 50 years, world food demand is going to grow by 70%. And we're already, with things like, with corn especially, we're already sweeping out the bins at the end of the year now with ethanol. And so we need to figure out, and part of the Farm Bill is also for research for all of these programs. Places like the University of Minnesota, universities all across the country do tons and tons of research to figure out, well, how are we going to feed 70% more when we're already really pushing the limits of what our, couple of million acres here in the U.S. can provide. We've got pretty much every tillable acre that we can get, and they bounce back and forth between CRP and stuff, but that's still a very small percentage. And I think those are kind of the few things I want to touch on, and I'm glad to answer any questions anybody has for me or anything else.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think we had an awesome panel and an awesome professor. Just give us a quick overview of a really complicated piece of legislation. So let's give them a hand before we do. Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciated that. And before I continue, I do want to say, before we do questions, I do want to say that there will be prizes for people who ask questions today. We're going to give out some of these McCarthy Center T-shirts, which my colleague Justin Martin is going to get. Yeah, ooh, they're pretty great. Also, I think there might be some calendars as well. Anyways, there's some goodies if you ask good questions. So I encourage you all to do so. And if you don't have a question, just comments, whatever. Honestly, it's a very informal setting and informal dialogue, like I was saying. So, do we have any questions right now?
All right, I got a question for you. So you talked a little bit about ethanol, but you got really editorial much, and I kind of want to hear your editorial. So, what do you think about ethanol? Do you think it's a good program, bad program?
The corn farmer in me loves ethanol, and the hog farmer in me hates ethanol. How's that? So what ethanol has done is it's driven up demand for corn. And, people talk about wealthy farmers, all this stuff, and that's really been in the last decade when the prices have skyrocketed because demand has been so high. But now that last year corn prices were about bounced between about $6.50 and $7.75 a bushel in 2012, fall 2012. And then all of a sudden this year corn prices kind of slumped down a little bit. And this fall, most of my dad's corn was sold between about $4.50 and $5. Some of you had sold, but that gets into the crop commodities markets, and that's way above any extent. And so I guess it's a good thing in that we're using our acreage, but it's a bad thing that I guess we're mandating that people have to use it in cars, and especially new push to 15% ethanol. And I know automobile manufacturers haven't really gotten to the point where they're comfortable doing that, and especially on older vehicles, it can hurt parts of the fuel systems and engines, and they won't warranty that and that kind of stuff. And it's really a mixed bag, and it's good for agriculture, it's good for commodities prices, it's good for crop farmers, but it also hurts the feed markets and feed supply. And now that corn's cheaper, it's become better, and really the crop and livestock markets are inverse. So when crop markets are down, livestock markets are up. When crop markets are up, livestock markets are down. So they kind of bounce back and forth off of each other. So it's just interesting to watch that and to see how this has really affected less so the actual production agriculture, but more so the agribusiness, the business management, farm management, how you diversify your portfolio and kind of manage what you're planting, what the farmer's doing.
Can I add on to what Ed was saying too?
We'll pass this over to you.
wanted to add on that I totally see that paradox where to elaborate, just not good for feed, but also for human feed. I mean, we're using an edible crop for fuel, and of course I'm all in favor of alternative energy sources and things like that, but I believe that there needs to be much more research into what other crops we can be used that aren't taken away from a main staple in ordinary people's diets.
That's a good point. Like I mentioned, there's about 13 billion bushels. About half of that goes into ethanol production. About 4 billion bushels, give or take, so that puts us at about 9, goes into animal feed, chickens, hogs, turkeys, etc., cattle. And about 1.2 to 1.5 billion is used in food products, so high fructose corn syrup for soda and food products, ground cornmeal for tortillas, corn chips, cornbread, all that kind of stuff. And so it hasn't really affected the supply, but it's affected the price. And Parker can elaborate a little more on that as well.
Just two little comments. There is a direct effect on the food costs around the world of our ethanol policy. So our ethanol policy is a great article from several years ago from Foreign Affairs called The Removable Feast, which ties high food prices in developing countries to our ethanol policy, because what it does is it takes land out of certain commodities, or it extracts what would have been exported to other markets and maintains it in the U.S. market. The second piece is that one of the challenges, and an environmental studies major might be able to look this up, but there's been a good amount of research by economists and by environmental scientists to suggest that ethanol, in fact, has a zero net energy gain. And so it is directly, basically, a continuation of farm subsidies. It's just a farm subsidy in a different way that has, in many ways, many more negative effects than traditional farm subsidies.
Well, I think ethanol is just a push for energy independence within the nation. That is sort of the basis behind why there is a big national push for that in some way. So, well, it's not like a complete renewable, reliable source of energy. There are other motives behind the ethanol market.
All right. Austin Egan had a question. He's just going to talk really loud because we are really restricted with this microphone. So.
All right. Dr. Wynn, you just mentioned more of the international perspective, and that's where I'd like to go into a bit more into farm. I'm really curious about Neil's perspective on the argument that subsidies, agricultural subsidies, do not allow U.S. farms and U.S. companies and U.S. agricultural production firms to compete on the international global stage.
Ed, did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard that.
Can you kind of repeat the question a little bit?
Basically, he's wondering if the subsidies, if the government's kind of playing with the agricultural market affects our ability to play on the world stage. That's the question. And I haven't done any personal research into it, so I can't elaborate on that so much. I know that the U.S. is a net exporter of agricultural products, mostly because we grow, everything we need here, we don't need to import from other countries, aside from, specialties and things like that. And so I know, like I mentioned, that 13 billion, about 2 billion of that is exported all around the world. Lots of our meat products are exported around the world. All kinds of products are exported. I don't know the intricacies, and maybe these guys do know a little more, but I don't think it hurts us, but I don't know if it necessarily helps us.
We do have a long history in a lot of ways. I mean, there are a number of programs. The Foreign Agricultural Service is primarily charged, part of USDA is charged with promoting U.S. agriculture abroad. And our policies, because they subsidize our production, lead to more production and probably more exports than we might otherwise have, or might otherwise need to have historically. We also have some aid programs, the PL 480, Public Law 480, which is a food aid program, which was established with the stated intent of providing commodities to foreign countries, which those countries could then sell to raise money for their, so it was a form of giving aid. And that presumably was to help farmers. There's a lot of debate over whether that's a good policy, but there are some clear programs that are intended to promote agricultural exports, and they do strengthen us. Cotton is one of the areas where there's been a lot of criticism from many West African economies where our cotton policies have promoted American cotton to the detriment of countries which in fact could produce similar quality cotton at a lower cost. So that's one area where you can see there's a positive effect for our farmers, but potentially a negative effect for some international producers.
And I think that last point on cotton is the point that you were getting at, whereas U.S. agriculture is kind of artificially inflated in a way because of the extra subsidies that are given and the priority that U.S. crops are given on the world market. And so whether that's a good or bad thing, I'm not sure.
We got a big question back there. Can you talk loud?
Sure. I'm wondering if the Farm Bill has any correlation or incentive toward local food for SNAP-dependent areas, and if it's working or doing any work toward education to food deserts or even transportation of local food to food deserts.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I know that it's something that's really been promoted heavily for this new Farm Bill. I'm not sure what the status is on it, but I do know that there have been recent stipulations, I believe, I don't know the exact details, but that people who are on food stamps can use that food stamp dollars at their local farmers markets. In terms of transportation and things like that, I'm not sure. You guys know anything?
Yeah, there are like embedded within the larger pieces of the Farm Bill, like smaller sort of like R&D type programs, kind of organic farming, and
What's R&D?
Research and development.
Okay.
Yes. So I think the SNAP programs that like allow people in poverty to purchase organic food are necessary, but a very minimal part of this.
And kind of going off, one more point is not necessarily promoting or organic necessarily either, but healthier choices. I know there's been a lot of work by different organizations to push less subsidies on things like corn because it does so much, like I was going to go into high fructose corn syrup and things like that, that generally are in foods that are nutritionally hurtful.
We had a question in the back.
Yeah. Going off of Austin's question, I was hoping the panelists could speak about how subsidies in the Farm Bill might be connected with free trade agreements, particularly NAFTA, and how these free trade agreements are generally harmful, particularly to Mexico and other countries in the region. So if you guys could speak to how our subsidies are affecting other countries.
Can you speak on that? Not a term?
I can try.
I probably reiterate.
It says, I mean, I can sort of reiterate, you know, there's actually two dimensions. The second question of the ethanol policy is the one, is that, you know, historically the U.S. has been a major exporter of agricultural commodities, and that has been a policy because that's one of the, you know, one of our major exports, that we want to promote American agriculture. We've got all this production, and so we've exported globally. We have the PL 480. Interestingly, this is where the ethanol policy, which has soaked up much of our excess production, has had the reverse effect, so that we export less, and this potentially has a negative effect on consumers in many markets which don't have adequate production. It's a very tricky balance. There is some sense that the global trade environment for agriculture is challenging because you're dealing with countries like Canada, which has its wheat board. You have the European Union, which has tight controls on agriculture. The parties that, and then, you know, even Brazil has had a long history of supporting its agriculture. For example, in the cane, sugar, ethanol, they developed that in the 60s and 70s for their own reasons. And so we're in an environment where there are many big players in the market that have do not promote free trade in their agricultural products, but there are many small parties, small countries that are probably negatively affected not just by U.S. agricultural policy, but by agricultural policy in all of the big players in the markets. So that's where I come to the countries like West Africa or small countries in the Caribbean which struggle with certain commodities. So that we have a negative effect, but it's in tandem with all the other big players in the market on these small producers. So that's probably too vague, Tom, but.
We got another question up here.
I was gonna hope that you guys could talk about how the Farm Bill relates to the Immigration Bill and how it might affect labor markets and so on.
I see the points you're making, whereas so many of our agricultural workers are migrant workers. Is that kind of the tie you're trying in? I don't think there's anything explicitly stated in the bill, but I think it's very important to note that the large majority of our agricultural industry is made up of undocumented citizens.
Edwin had a question too, and then we have one over here.
The question is, why is it called the Farm Bill when we say that it has to do with SNAP? So is that just to get the wider support, and is it just to get the cost of Congress? My other question is, who really benefits from the Farm Bill? Does this, a lot of things that are the Farm Bill helps small farmers. Is that really true when 75% of the larger farmers are the ones who actually get this subsidy?
We can start with the name question. It's called the Farm Bill colloquially, but it's not the actual title of the actual bill. It's just what it's most commonly referred to as. So Dr. Whitley here has 15 different names it's been in the past. Currently, it's the Food Conservation and Energy Act of 2008, which is the technical term of the Farm Bill. And then to go off who it actually helps, I mean, that was kind of the question I posed earlier with, up to 80% of it going to people who aren't necessarily farmers. It's a really good question. Why would it be colloquially referred to as the Farm Bill? And in terms of large agribusiness as opposed to small farmers, can you talk about that, Ed?
Basically, the government is working on a market-based approach, not on an individual approach. So things like direct payments, things like subsidies are basically on a per bushel produced, per acre run, things like that. And the subsidies are a lot smaller proportion for a large farmer as they are for a small farmer. Like our family, direct payments, which you're looking at eliminating, I don't think many farmers will have a problem with that because it's like $2,500 on several hundreds of thousands of dollars of corn produced. But there's other programs, it's basically designed to help the smaller farmers compete, but at the same time, the subsidies are just basically market-wide. They're not on an individual farmer by farmer basis.
We have a politics at Pint talking about the government shutdown and how there was lack of communication about what to cut and with spending and stuff. How does the Farm Bill reflect those the mentality of trying to conserve as much, trying to cut the deficit, trying to sort of increase, trying to sustain it?
I think most of that again happens in the SNAP and the two proposals that are out there right now. The House proposal, which obviously is mostly written by Republicans, aims to cut $40 billion out of SNAP in 10 years. And, I don't know the details of that. The Senate proposal aims to cut $4 billion out of 10 years, which, in the federal budget, $40 billion is a rounding error, basically. So it's hard to say. And I know definitely part of the U.S. policy is to promote our agriculture. Agriculture is still, dollar-wise, a huge business in the U.S. It takes up the most land, it takes up the most resources here in the U.S. because we have good agriculture, because we have good universities, because we have good farmers. And so really, it is a priority. And so I think as part of the shutdown was more over things like defense, other entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all that stuff, versus the Farm Bill, which is what's the total dollar amount for the Farm Bill in the current Farm Bill?
It's 146 billion for FY14 is the budget.
Okay, so so that's again a small percentage of the federal budget. So even if you cut a huge amount out of it, it'd be a small percentage of anything.
I'd like to comment. I don't think it's a rounding error if you're looking at people that already have a family of four reduced. $36 a month may not seem like very much money to you, but it makes a lot of difference. So it may be a rounding error if you're a farmer. It's not a rounding error for the.
Well, and the budget, and that doesn't, I see where you're coming from, and I definitely agree with that. It's a rounding error when you compare it to the $1 trillion budget.
I don't disagree with that, but I'm trying to get down the skip of the people who are in.
And what it really aims to cut out is some of the abuse, some of the, bad programs, some of the other things in there. It doesn't aim to cut out, they don't want to cut out poor families who are getting these, getting this money, getting these benefits because
they want
need it.
less money to go to families that are hungry. I'm sorry.
I haven't read it, so I can't, go on a dot for dot basis, but I know, the aim isn't to leave families hungry. It's to help make our budget and our whole government a little more efficient, a little better utilized.
Do you believe that? Do you believe that cutting the budget would help prevent corruption?
Cutting the budget help prevent corruption.
Like what you're saying is if we're to cut spending on it, would that
cut on the basis of our politicians or the basis of people?
I'm saying like $40 billion in regards to $4 billion.
I think that's what it hopes to do. I don't know if that's what it will end up doing. And that's I think that's one of the big sticking points of the current two bills. And I'm not saying, I'm for one and against the other. I'm just, talking about kind of the generalities of it.
Kind of to put numbers on it, the $40 billion cut would be 3% of what goes to SNAP, what is being proposed by the House, and it would be 0.5% in the Senate. So it would be comparatively large from small, but I have to definitely hear Professor Kavijay's point that on family by family income, it would be huge cuts.
We have a question, Bridget in the back.
Can you guys talk about the politics surrounding the Farm Bill? Like, what are the major issues that we're seeing disagreement on with the parties?
Great question, Bridget.
I'll make a comment, so I'll talk about this. This came up, I gave a talk on Food Day about the food policy in the United States. So the question here really is ultimately the cuts in food stamps is a political question. Because the goal to decouple the Farm Bill from the Food Bill is a political choice. There's real no other reason, because what they're trying to do is by decoupling it, one group is trying to claw away votes from food subsidies. Because if they don't, if they can pass the farm subsidies without the food, then they no longer have to have this compromise between different parties. And so they can get what they want, and then they don't have to give anything in return. So there's a political motivation there, because in the past there's been a willingness on both sides to sort of make this compromise in the interest of the different constituents. So the challenge with the cuts in food stamps is that's also a political move, because it's, as Ed says, from an accounting perspective, it is a rounding error. But from a political perspective, if you're campaigning in Mississippi, which happens to be my home state, and you say you're cutting food stamps from the Cadillac welfare recipient, it sounds real good, even though it's not an accurate portrayal of the amount of fraud in the program. It turns out the amount of fraud in these programs are minuscule by a large measure. From pure, just statistical analysis shows a small amount of fraud. So that's where it is. It's driven by politics. It's not driven by, it's not really a question of efficiency, because it is such a small share of the budget. it's very hard to see it being a cost-saving perspective. It seems to be all political. That's just my point. So.
And then something that I've been bringing lately too is that these cuts, it's not like they won't be spending the money, but the cuts in SNAP will be going to things like new farm subsidies and expanded crop insurance. So it's not that the bills will be less expensive, it's just where there will be allocation of money, which is also, you know, politically divisive as well.
My question was just on Dr. Wiley's last point. I was at your presentation on Tuesday, and I remember you talked a lot about the long-term benefits of maintaining things like programs like SNAP. I was wondering if it might be helpful if you could mention a couple of those longer-term benefits right now for like all of us.
Well, because on the talk, she's bringing up the food policy. When we talked, she was asking about, when she saw the talk earlier, there was a discussion of what are the long-term economic benefits of food programs. Because we can talk about the same similar sort of things about all these policies, environmental, agriculture, and food. But there's clear evidence to suggest that at least some programs like WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children Program, the National School Lunch Program, are both going to improve nutrition among young households, among young families, and thus improve their healthiness. And there is actual data to suggest that the Women, Infants, and Children Program, which is just a fraction of the size of the SNAP program, has a basically, is it a $5 return for every $1 spent? Because what you've done is you've improved the nutritional productivity of the worker over their life, and as a result, and you've improved their ability to benefit from education because their brain develops better. The evidence for SNAP is a little more tenuous in terms of its direct long-term impact, because you're dealing with a broader population, but there is some evidence to suggest that it does improve some aspects of the nutritional quality of households. Not universally, but the primary thing it does is what's the policy supposed to do, is it increases the caloric intake of the household, which presumably, if your goal is to make sure that people are adequately fed, that's successful. But there's a lot of research trying to look at how is doing this now, how is that, not even considering social justice issues, which are of course important, very important, but from a prudential perspective, there's a long-term payoff from investing in that now. So there's been, like I said, there's been work on that.
Yeah, Connor's got a question on top.
So I was talking about eliminating the direct payments to farmers not being a big deal for big farmers, but how would the farm bill affect those smaller farms if they're eliminating those direct payments?
Like I said, that's on an acre by acre, a bushel by bushel basis. So I know a friend of mine raises, he runs 200 acres, his dad runs a few more, about 350, and he said it's a pittance, it's a rounding error in their budget, really. It's not something that's a make or break for them. It's a nice few dollars to go towards whatever equipment maintenance, things for next year. But the much bigger things for the average farmer in the farm bill are crop insurance, some of the other money that goes into keeping the market kind of stable and upright. And I guess I didn't mention nobody's mentioned crop insurance before, but that's definitely one of the biggest parts of the farm bill, is obviously a government-backed insurance agency for the farmers, because farming is a very risky business inherently. You put a seed in the ground and you hope that 6 months later it's going to be ready to harvest with some kind of yield. To put money in your bank and food in your family's stomach and all that. So I think crop insurance is definitely one of those things that kind of, it works efficiently, and I think for the most part, I know some people may have some other ideas about that, but it's definitely a major aspect of the farm bill for the average farmer.
I think going back to kind of my perspective earlier on climate change and with the new changes that farmers are going to have to deal with, I think crop insurance is especially important as well, because we don't know what is going to happen in the next couple of years, like I said before, with the magnitude and speed at which global temperatures and precipitation are changing. Crop insurance is an important measure as well. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but I was talking really fast, where because of the gridlock, the farmers who lost all of the cattle in the early frost this year have not been paid for that huge loss of income. And so that doesn't directly tie in, but goes back to the economic consequences of this gridlock.
All right, so if you ask the question, and you aren't Ben Hutter because he already has one, then you can get a shirt back there, or a calendar, yeah, one of the two. And then also, I realize there's some hands still up, but I think this is an important question to ask. I wanted you guys to talk about, like, what happens if we don't pass the farm bill? What happens if that doesn't happen? I think that's an important question to end on. I apologize to those who had their hands up, but I think we need to talk about it.
Well, the Farm Bill expired September 30th of this year. It officially expired last year, September 30th. It passed a one-year extension of the 2008 Farm Bill. So currently we're without a current Farm Bill. Now, most of the money, the Farm Bill doesn't allocate money. It sets the budget. It sets pretty much the upper limit, and then the allocations committees and what have you in Congress are responsible for actually writing the check, which comes later. So most of the money for things like crop insurance, and now like Katie mentioned, the cattle farmers haven't gotten paid because of the shutdown, so everything was backed up. I know there's a few checks that got missed for us for our CRP payments, things like that, while the government was shut down, that have now since gotten paid. So the biggest thing that would happen if the Farm Bill wouldn't get passed it'd be 6 months or a year, but prices would spike because it would go back to the controls set in one of the original bills, like 1938, where it sets prices to some insane level. Basically, it's like the nuclear option or whatever happened.
It's called parity pricing. Parity, yeah. So they revert back to parity pricing.
So basically, they like
every bill. So the idea is the bill is particularly true in dairy. So you would revert prices back to. So for example, if a bushel of corn bought a pair of blue jeans in 1949, you'd have to raise the price of a bushel of corn to the price of a pair of blue jeans. Does that sort of make sense? So it would go from, what's the price now?
About $4.80.
About $4.80 per bushel to $45 a bushel. I mean, that's sort of an extreme example. The most direct, most immediate effect would be on dairy.
And that would go to about $7 a gallon. Milk could go to about $7 a gallon. I don't know about 100-weight price.
Edwin has his hand up, and I apologize for cutting him off, but if you still have questions that you want to talk to these panelists and Dr. Weekly about, I bet they can stick around a little bit longer. I don't know if they think so, they feel free to head out. I'm sure some of these panelists could talk to you still, so feel free to stick around. If that was okay. If you did have your hand up though, and you were going to ask a good question, then help yourself to a calendar as well. I apologize for cutting you. Thanks for coming, everyone.